Welcome to another episode of the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. President Donald Trump was inaugurated earlier this week, and it looks like there could be a change in Canada-U.S. relations. Trump, of course, has floated the idea of tariffs and also making Canada the 51st state. Whether or not he's serious is up for debate, but it's certainly been a focus of the media as of late. All this is in the backdrop of Donald Trump's meeting this morning at the WEF in Davos, a Canadian election looming, a leadership race for the Liberal Party, and the renegotiation of the USMCA agreement. So it's a really interesting time in Canada-US relations. A lot of Canadian analysts are closely watching the words of Donald Trump, and people are trying to understand how this administration thinks of America's role in the world and how this Trump administration is going to impact our bilateral relationship as well as the relationship that the United States has with allies like NATO. So here today again to unpack and discuss the Canada-US relationship, discuss all the latest from the inauguration, the upcoming USMCA renegotiation, and more. We have Xavier Delgado, a fellow at the Wilson Center and also a CDA Institute junior fellow. And Xavier will be talking about this and unpacking it with us and explaining to us what the atmosphere currently is in Washington just days after the inauguration. This is the Expert Series. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Expert Series podcast. I'm here with CDAI junior fellow, Xavier Delgado, who's also over at the Wilson Center, the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Xavier, it's always really great to have you on. And today we're going to talk the latest in U.S.-Canada relations, a lot going on there. So I'm really eager to hear some of your perspectives.
And I'm eager to be here and happy to be chatting with you again, Josh. Thanks for having me back.
Great. Just to set the scene a little bit, I'm just curious if you can maybe describe what the atmosphere in Washington has been since the inauguration, and for you, if there was any takeaways or anything of interest on Inauguration Day or within Trump's speech, anything within that of which maybe is notable for Canada too.
Well, any presidential inauguration, I think, is an opportunity to rethink the United States' relationships with foreign allies, adversaries, its strategy for engaging abroad, its domestic policy at home. We've certainly already seen it. I mean, at the time of recording, we're barely over 48 hours into the Trump administration. There's already a significant pivot from the Biden era policies. The president made it very clear that he's not going to take the same approach to the United States' relationship with its allies. He's going to implement a very different foreign policy for the United States. There's a lot of changes that have been signaled, and indeed already a lot of changes that we've seen on the ground here, executed through executive orders.
I'm wondering if you might be able to unpack some of those executive orders, if you can, and let us know what you think were some of the more interesting ones, or if there's any orders that might particularly impact the CANUS relationship.
Well, I think as a lot of people noted, the biggest news about Canada on day one of the administration was that there was really no news. The president had noted, or promised rather, in the run up to his inauguration that he would be implementing day one tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. And then when day one rolled around, those tariffs weren't put in place. There was a brief moment of relief, I think, for America's North America partners. And then at the end, by the end of the day, he'd promised that he'd be implementing those 25% universal tariffs on February 1st. So again, this is in line with what we've seen from the Trump administration. The president is a negotiator. He comes from a background in business. And this is very similar to what we saw during his first administration, where he kicked it off by threatening to tear up the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eventually resulted in a renegotiated NAFTA that became USMCA. So I think that's the most significant takeaway. It's worth noting as well, Josh, that he just finished a speech at the World Economic Forum. He delivered it through video conference, and Canada came up. He reiterated his claims that the United States has a massive trade deficit with Canada. He again made jokes about Canada becoming the 51st state, and he underscored this worldview that the United States is being disrespected and taken advantage of by allies, including by name this time, Canada.
So, I mean, it's highly, highly improbable that Canada would ever become the 51st state. I mean, anything's possible. But back to your note about the NAFTA renegotiations, obviously there's been a lot of analysis in the Canadian and American news about what exactly Trump means by 51st state, whether or not tariffs are actually going to happen. And as you said, Trump is a businessman, and this is kind of a noted negotiation tactic he's used. So, from your perspective, I mean, what exactly can we infer from these remarks? Do we think that maybe Trump is just trying to maybe set the scene for an early NAFTA negotiation or a negotiation where America can benefit a little more? What's your take there?
Well, he's definitely trying to accumulate as much leverage over his North American trading partners as possible. But I think it points, Josh, to a much deeper fundamental skepticism about the United States' relationship with Canada and Mexico. I genuinely think that the White House's worldview is that the United States isn't being treated fairly by its trading partners. He goes back and forth between a $200 billion trade deficit and a $250 billion trade deficit. If you just count goods and services trade between Canada and the United States in 2023, it's significantly lower than that. I think it's around 40 to $60 billion of a trade deficit for the United States. But what he's including, and this was, I think, confirmed by CNN through a Trump Vance transition spokesman earlier this week, what they're including in that 200 to $250 billion calculation is U.S. defense expenditures that benefit Canada. And of course, that's not typically included in a trade calculation, but it points to the fact that the United States also views its defense and security partnership with Canada as something in which it's being taken advantage of by laggard Canadian defense spending and lack of Canadian investment into that area of shared responsibility.
Well, thanks, Abby. Maybe we can sort of discuss, despite some of these challenges, or even if you want to call them disruptions in the Canada-U.S. relationship, maybe we can focus for a second on how Canada can still um, work together with the United States and vice versa, and and maintain the relationship. I know that Prime Minister Trudeau recently said after a meeting with the premiers that you know Canada can still be a part of this quote unquote golden age that Trump is speaking of, this American golden age, and that Canada can be a partner in helping America achieve what it wants to achieve. I'm not sure if you saw that or if our listeners did. But with that said, from your perspective, where are some areas of potential collaboration and opportunity that can come out of this new administration?
Well, the good news is that the administration is very upfront about what they want from Canada. I think I don't think they're saying that Canada is not going to be a U.S. partner. What they're pushing for is for Canada to be a more reliable partner on things like security and defense. I think they'd love to see Canadian defense spending increase to 2%. In fact, the president's team has been signaling that they'd like defense spending for NATO partners to go up to 5%. I think that they'd be more than happy to see Canada spend more on the border and be a reliable partner in managing illegal immigration across the U.S.-Canada border. I think they'd be thrilled to continue being a trading partner with Canada if they can balance a trade relationship that, in their mind, is unfair and unadvantageous for the United States. So it's not that the United States isn't interested in engaging abroad. It's not like the United States is being isolationist. I think it's much more that the United States is trying to remedy partnerships, alliances, and relationships that it sees as being unfair to the American people.
Thanks, Abby. Maybe we can unpack that line of thinking a bit more. You kind of alluded to it in the opening salvo there of this discussion, but what can be inferred, or what are the takeaways of some of the remarks or potential policies that the Trump administration has articulated so far, and what does it say about this administration's view of America's role in the world? And is there articulation or sense of what America's role in the world should be drastically different than Biden, or a bit of a continuation? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it all comes back to America first. It's really the core pillar. It was the core pillar of the campaign. It's a core pillar of the Trump administration in its early days. I think it's going to continue to be the guiding North Star that they follow when they build policy. But it's important to know, I think when America First came around in 2016 during his first campaign, a lot of people thought that meant America alone or America isolated. That's not really the case. What we're seeing in the second Trump administration, at least in the early days, is that America first means America dominant and American exceptionalism. It's not that America doesn't want to have trade relationships with allies. It's that America wants to be exporting more than it's importing from allies. They want to be selling to the world. It's not that America doesn't want to be exporting any energy, it's that they want more energy exports to flow out of America than in. It's that they don't want to be relying on allies to produce things like critical minerals, automobiles, lumber, all things, by the way, that were name checked during Trump's World Economic Forum speech that he says the United States doesn't need from Canada. It means making America more independent, better leveraging the resources, whether natural, human, or otherwise, available to the American people. Um, to better strengthen the United States so it can stand alone. Yes, with allies, but perhaps reducing vulnerability and reliance on some of those critical U.S. partners.
We've seen similar rhetoric and language and sentiments in the Canadian context as well, not just with the conservatives, but the liberals to a degree too. And we've seen it in other parts of the Western world, this kind of shift towards, more independence, a country's ability to rely on itself to produce goods and bolster its national security. So, do you think that this could perhaps be seen as kind of a pushback against the stage of globalization we've seen within the past 20 or 30 odd years? You might disagree or agree with that. I'm not sure. And also, where do you think this sentiment that we're seeing all around the Western world is coming from, or what's the reason for it in your estimation? This sort of America first, Canada first, bring back manufacturing kind of concept.
I think part of it, Josh, is this new perception of how we can secure our countries, not just through classic or traditional defense means, but now through a lens of economic security. That we don't want to be importing critical minerals from China, oil from Venezuela, gas from Russia, and other adversaries who when we do so, have the leverage to just turn off the taps and leave us exposed. That's closing that vulnerability was a major part of the Trump administration's foreign policy. It continued under the Biden administration. There's a reason the Biden administration didn't lift all of the Trump era tariffs on Chinese goods. And I think it's going to continue under the Trump administration. But the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is I think the Biden administration was a little bit more willing to lean on allies as it sought to nearshore, ally shore the supply chains for those critical goods. The Trump administration, I think, is much more focused on further reducing America's reliance on other countries so that it can better produce those products and goods at home as opposed to needing to work with Canada or Mexico. Again, I don't think this means the complete end of North American trade, but I think it does signal that the Trump administration, wherever it can produce things at home, would prefer to do so. And then the second half of that, Josh, is I think it's worth recognizing that you know you decades into the era of North American free trade, globalization hasn't worked for everybody. And that's a real sentiment that's felt on the ground here in Washington, certainly along some of the regions in the United States that have been particularly hard hit by globalization. And a lot of the economic sentiment in the United States, in Canada, certainly to an extent in Mexico, is that globalization and free trade agreements have opened up the economy to abuse from outside partners. And what we're seeing now is a lot of pushback on that from those hard hit areas.
It's an interesting comment and insight that I agree with. I mean, globalization has been a great thing depending on where you look in the world. Perhaps if we want to say maybe parts of the what some might call the global south, but for former manufacturing sectors and in the Midwest and even in parts of Canada, it has had some might say a negative impact on North American workers. So that's a very interesting insight, and I think probably one of the things that propelled Trump to victory not once but twice.
And it's a great point, Josh, because yes, if you look at the cumulative data for trade, which has increased, GDP, which has increased, GDP per capita, which has largely increased, it paints a very different picture than when you look sort of under the covers and see that that hasn't been distributed evenly across the entire economy. There have been winners and there have been losers. Um, and the people who have lost in globalization are rightfully upset that the benefits haven't extended to them. And I think when we take a more simplistic view of globalization, just look at the bottom dollar figures and see that there's been an increase in trade volume and an increase in GDP. It minimizes and erases the impact that it's had on the ground for a lot of industries and markets across North America. And although it might be convenient to ignore it, if we're going to be crafting fair policy and trying to understand where some of these political forces are coming from. It's something that we have to acknowledge.
That's a great point, Savvy. And something else of note. I know that you do a bit of work on tech too. I'm not sure to what extent you can speak robustly about AI, but obviously there were announcements about huge investments in AI. Uh, what do you think this means, especially vis-a-vis the relationship with China, which is, we kind of almost, it seems like in a bit of an AI arms race. I don't know if we want to use that exact term, arms race, but we're definitely seeing competition between China and the US. So I'm curious what you thought of those announcements.
I mean, obviously significant competition between China and the United States, and Canada has a stake in all this as a country that has contributed to the AI, to the AI sphere largely through thought leadership. I mean, two of the godfathers of AI come from Canada. Canada has a great research and development space. Um, yeah, these US investments are significant. I think it also points to how big tech has bought into the Trump administration and is trying to ride some of the benefits that are going to come from increased investment opportunities, deregulation, and a more business and innovation friendly environment south of the border. Canada should be trying to play a role in this. I mean, we have an enormous opportunity north of the border to build data centers and to use our uranium and nuclear energy to power those data centers. I already in the United States, that's a trend that we're seeing, by the way. I think Microsoft is the one that has the contract to revitalize 3 Mile Island in the Northeast and use that to power data centers. So it's an enormous opportunity for Canada. And again, it's one of those areas where Canada could be contributing on top of US strengths as opposed to replacing US strength in these fields.
For our next question, you and I had multiple podcast discussions on this very topic now, but I'm wondering if there's any updates we can speak about since the last time we got together. USMCA, we've been kind of walking around this entire discussion, or rather, it's been a bit of a backdrop for the discussion we're having right now on Canada-US relations. Has anything changed going into the renegotiation, and how can Canada best advocate for itself, maybe, and what is the United States looking for going into the negotiation? We've already kind of touched on some of it, but maybe you could speak to that more.
Well, we definitely have the contours of what the US position is going to be, which is that North American trade is unfair. We're almost exactly back to where we were when we were talking about tearing up NAFTA in 2016 to 2018, is that we have an agreement that is unfair to the United States. And I can't imagine a world where they wouldn't want to try renegotiating it. They're already threatening universal tariffs against both USMCA partners. So it's perhaps not the most subtle approach from the White House, but it clearly projects and communicates their position on the matter, which is that this is going to end up being a renegotiation, and can Canada and Mexico better come with fair offers for how they want to deal with a renegotiation of the agreement. I don't know where the U.S. is going to fall on specific issues. I can't imagine things like the digital services tax are going to pass much muster here in Washington. It was already a problem under the Biden administration. Something like that is going to be uh, an easy target for the Trump administration. But I'd keep an eye on the space in the coming months. If if the United States wants to renegotiate its its position in the USMCA, it's going to need trade promotion authority, which they're going to have to get through the U.S. Congress. That'll be a whole separate process, especially with the slim majorities that they currently have in Congress. But expect this space to start developing in the coming months, even beyond what we're already seeing with the initial threat of tariffs and the talk of trade deficits.
Zavi, thanks for that. One other thing I think is rather interesting, like yourself and a lot of other experts and academics and thought leaders have this belief that, well, it's a kind of a longstanding belief that no matter really who is the president or who is the prime minister, Canada and the United States have such an integrated, mutually beneficial relationship that, you know, if- whoever is in power in either country, that relationship is likely to continue out of mutual interest. So, we do see the media quite often report on things President Trump says. Um, do you think when this reporting happens, it might be missing what's going on behind the scenes? And is it possible that people are getting a full picture and sense of the health of the relationship if they're just sort of consuming mainstream media? I'm not sure if that's something you want to touch on at all.
No, it's a fair question, Josh, because the Canada-U.S. relationship is enormous. And it's really hard to grasp the scale of just how big it is. Yes, it's trade. Yes, it's security. It's also shared culture. It's also the border. It's a shared language. It's a shared history. It's energy. It's if you look at any one facet of the relationship and really dig deep, you realize that the roots for Canada-US relations really go much deeper than one would expect when just looking at the surface. But of course, it's important to keep an eye on the headline issues because they do affect the general health of the relationship, especially on how Americans perceive Canadians and Canadians perceive Americans. I think that cannot be undersold for its importance to the relationship, particularly with leaders that we have nowadays. Donald Trump, who really does listen to what his base thinks, and when his base isn't doesn't like the political leadership in Canada, or vice versa, when Canadians don't like the political leadership in the United States, that will impact how our leaders in Washington and Ottawa interact with each other. Now, there are day-to-day functions that happen between Canada and the United States. Border services on the Canadian side work with the American side, and a lot of that is just an integrated system that, yes, has federal oversight, but largely runs on its own. These parts of the relationship do happen every day, and Canadians are talking to Americans every day. But we do need to pay attention to the big issues, and we do have to pay attention to the posturing by our leaders because it does signal to the rest of the government and the rest of society how the relationship is going and what the health of Canada-US relationships are.
Xavier, thanks for joining me. I know you are a busy man, and I want to thank you once again for always making time for the podcast. Before I let you go, I just want we've covered a lot of topics here: NATO alliances, the inaugural speech, some of the executive orders, and the NAFTA renegotiation. Before we wrap this up, I just want to give you one final opportunity to, provide some last or final thoughts, and maybe speak to anything you think is important that we didn't get a chance to cover.
I mean, I would just keep abreast of any updates. This situation changes day by day. There's a chance, Josh, that you'll go back and edit this, and then by the time you get it out, there'll be a whole new
Yep.
uh, line of dialogue opened on Canada-US relations. It can really come from anywhere. And that's just the news cycle that we live in during this administration. They're looking to do a lot in their first 100 days. And Canada is sort of scrambling to put together a response, whether it's from the first ministers, the premiers on their own, the federal government on its own. It's really quickly moving. For folks who are trying to follow it, I just encourage you to have good information. A lot gets sensationalized in the media nowadays, especially in this information age that we live in, where things can spread on social media so quickly. Please just check your sources. Please make sure you're following balanced coverage and just make sure that the information that you're getting is updated because it changes so quickly in this environment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Delgado. I'd like to remind my audience that Xavi is over at the Wilson Center, DC-based Wilson Center's Canada Institute. And as Xavi just mentioned about good information, if you want to learn about the United States, if you want to learn about the U.S.-Canada relationship, I would wager that there's no better place to learn about it than the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. So thanks so much, Xavi, for joining me, and I can't wait for our next conversation.
It's always a pleasure, Josh. Thanks for having me.
And that brings us to an end of today's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks again for Xavier Delgado, our excellent fellow over at Wilson Center, for joining us for another discussion on Canada-US relations. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time as well. Take care.